Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the Bernina L460 Serger Manual. Today I want to explore the difference between the 3-thread rolled hem and the 2-thread rolled hem. Typically 2-thread stitches are not very common, and I was flipping through the instruction manual, and when I was looking at the chart on page 23, I noticed that there are a lot of 2-thread stitches included on this chart for this serger, and I think it's kind of fun to compare, what the 3-thread version versus the 2-thread version are doing. So let's get started, and I'm going to show you how to set up your machine for a 3-thread rolled hem. We'll start with that one. So I'm going to get my serger set up so you can see up close and personal, and I will be right back. All right, so I'm going to be using thread colors similar to those printed on the front of the machine for each part. So I'm going to be using ivory for the left needle, green for the right needle, black for the upper looper, and red for the lower looper. That way you'll be able to see how each thread contributes to the stitch. And of course, because we're doing a 3-thread and a 2-thread, we're not going to be using all of those colors, and that way you'll be able to see really obviously when we compare the 3-thread to the 2-thread rolled hem, which thread takes over or which thread is eliminated. All right, so to get started, I am going to just set up my machine for the 3-thread rolled hem, and I'm going to start by threading my upper looper through the pre-tension guide, down through the tension, clicking along the thread guides, and then into the eye of the looper. Take a minute to make sure your thread is coming off the spool properly, going through all of the thread guides without getting hung up or tangled on anything. Right, so there's that one. Now let me do my lower looper through the pre-tension unit, tension unit, thread guides, put that back. Okay, now I'm going to thread through the eye of the looper. Okay, so I've got everything threaded. Now let's look at the settings for a rolled hem. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my presser foot off so you can see here. And I'm going to put my knife down too. Okay. Okay, so the first thing I have to do is disengage the stitch finger. The stitch finger is right here. Okay, and the control for it is this little lever right here. If I push it towards me, notice the stitch finger disappears. Let me just do that again. There it is. Now it's disengaged. All right, so the reason why we disengage the stitch finger is because the stitch finger acts as support for the looper threads to wrap around, and also it supports the edge of the fabric. So if we're trying to make a rolled hem where the fabric is actually rolling, like this, we don't want that stitch finger engaged because the fabric won't be able to roll. So I've disengaged my stitch finger, and then I'm also going to put my blade back up while I'm here. Okay, and then I'm going to make my cutting width 5, which is the minimum cutting width. Okay, so I did that. And then I'm going to set my stitch length, which is over here. I'm going to set that to 1 for now. Now that's not the most dense setting for a rolled hem, but I'm going to start at 1. Okay, so I've got that all set up. And I'm going to start just by first putting all of my tensions on top to neutral, or 4. All right, let's talk a minute about how a 3-thread rolled hem is formed. As the stitch forms, the upper looper thread is wrapped all the way around to the back of the stitch by a snug lower looper tension setting. So I'm going to put my lower looper tension setting to start on 6. Now, in order for the upper looper to roll around to the underside, we want to loosen it a little bit so it has a little bit of wiggle room or a little less tension to roll to the wrong side. So I'm going to put my upper looper on 3.5. So I'm just going to loosen it a little bit. And then the needle thread, that's what holds the whole stitch together. So it works together with the lower looper thread to really secure the stitch and you know, create a nice roll in the fabric, and it helps to hold that lower looper thread down tight. So for now, I'm going to leave it at 4. We may want to change that setting, but I'm going to leave it at 4 for now. All right, so let's get some lightweight cotton first. All right, let's take a look at this. All right, so you can see that on this single layer of really lightweight cotton, I think the differential feed setting needs to be adjusted because you can see that the stitch is not laying flat. I think it's actually being gathered up by the tension on the threads. And that can happen when you're trying to use a 3-thread rolled hem to finish the edge of something, because you're working with a single layer. Sometimes really thin fabrics need a slight differential feed setting under 1, so like to 0.7. All right, but other than that, let's look at what's going on. Okay, you can see, if you look really carefully, you can see at the base of the stitch, you can see the right needle thread running along the base of the stitch, and it's mingling with the upper looper threads. And then if we turn it to the wrong side, you can see that the black upper looper thread is rolling to almost the base of the stitch, but we've got some red lower looper thread showing as little loops here. That means the lower looper is not tight enough. So I'm going to move my tension setting to 7. Okay, so I'm going from 6 to 7. I'm putting my differential feed on 0.7, and let's stitch another sample and see how it comes out. So those are the only 2 changes I'm making. So I think changing the differential feed definitely fixed the fact that the fabric was gathering up, because now it's laying nice and flat. Let's look at the underside. Okay, so now you can see a little bit of the red, but it's not creating loops. So I'm much happier with the 7 for a lower looper tension setting. Let me bring the other first sample back up here so you can see. Let's just compare. So you can see a big difference between what the underside of this stitch looks like. All right, so you want to play with it on a sample until you get it locked down tight like that. That's how a 3-thread rolled hem looks. Now let's change the setup of the serger for a 2-thread rolled hem. And really the big difference here is with a 2-thread rolled hem, we're not going to use the upper looper thread. So I'm going to cut that and pull that out. And the lower looper is still threaded. I'm going to take that thread and I'm just going to bring it down underneath the upper looper for a minute, because what we want to do is install the upper looper converter. The upper looper converter is a little piece that looks like this, and basically what it does is it covers the hole, and it creates a situation where the upper looper can still be in motion, but we're not going to thread it. So you put it into this little clip right here, you stick it in there, and then you rotate it down and you put the little pin on the end of the converter into the hole of the upper looper. Then I'm going to bring the lower looper thread back up so it's sitting in front of the upper looper like that. All right, so now that's set up for a 2-thread rolled hem. So now I'm just going to rethread my right needle with the green thread. Okay, so now you can see it looks like Christmas here. We just have 2 colors. We have red and green for the right needle and the lower looper. We have the lower looper converter on. Now here's the first interesting difference is the tension settings. Remember, to create a 3-thread rolled hem, the lower looper thread was really doing all the work. It was pulling that upper looper thread all the way around to the back and locking it down underneath the stitch. Well, for a 2-thread rolled hem, the lower looper thread is still doing all the work, except instead of pulling the upper looper thread underneath, the lower looper thread is going to wrap from top to bottom. So what we want to do is we are going to back off that tension and make it 4. Okay, so it has enough give to wrap front to back. Okay, and then I'm just going to leave the needle thread at 4. Let's see what we get this time. All right, so all the other settings were the same. I left the differential feed, the stitch length, and everything else the same. This 2-thread rolled hem is formed nicely front to back, but the looper threads are not evenly spaced along the edge. So to fix it, let's try shortening the stitch length. This is a stitch length of 1. I'm going to move it down to halfway between 1 and 0.8. Okay, so let's see what that does. All right, so let's compare this one to the first one. All right, so you can see that the second sample has a more even look to it. The looper threads are more evenly spaced and closer together. The reason why that is because the lower looper thread is doing all of the work here. Instead of having a second thread to hold it tight at the base of the stitch, the lower looper is wrapping front to back, and it's mingling with the needle thread at the base of the stitch to form the stitch. So I think for this lightweight cotton, we needed more stitches or more looper threads, per inch to get a nice even support for that roll of the fabric. So that's what the 2-thread looks like. Now let's compare the 3-thread to the 2-thread. Okay, so basically once you get your settings right for either the 3-thread rolled hem or the 2-thread rolled hem, they almost look identical. So now let's look at the back side. Again, they're almost identical. So really the only difference is in the case of the 2-thread, the lower looper thread is wrapping front to back, and in the case of the 3-thread rolled hem, the upper looper is being locked down tight by the lower looper. So that's what these 2 stitches look like. I think just for a practical suggestion, I think that I would save the 2-thread rolled hem for my finest, most lightweight fabrics because it's a little less bulky because you're only using 2 threads, whereas the 3-thread rolled hem I think is more stable and it's a little bit stronger, so it can roll fabrics that are a little bit heavier weight. So that would be the difference between the 3-thread rolled hem and the 2-thread rolled hem. I have one more tip for you when you're doing a rolled hem on lightweight fabric. If as you're trying to stitch along, if the stitch is not forming properly or if it's pulling away from the edge of the fabric, try a piece of wash away stabilizer or lightweight tracing paper underneath the fabric, between the fabric and the feed dogs, and as it stitches it will support that fabric and help the stitch form properly. So that's a little tip for you if you're working with really lightweight fabrics to create a rolled hem edge. And again, I would reserve the 2-thread rolled hem for your most lightest fabrics that you're using because it's not as strong. It only has the 2 threads working for you to roll that fabric. And if you have any questions or comments about a specific fabric or a problem you're having with your rolled hem, please post those below and I will help you. If you have any specific questions about things that you're having trouble with on your serger, please post those as well because I love doing Q&A in these videos to help people. So, you know, post your questions. I hope you're enjoying this series, and I will see you again next Sunday for another episode of the Bernina L460 Serger Manual.